might notice I have a bit of a cold, so bear with me. But I felt like it was important to show up and share this talk. So junior developer interview prep, part 2, technical skills. It will cover a lot of things. I'm gonna try to keep to it and answer some questions, but I will keep the majority of the questions at the end. But Madsen, do feel free to, if there's a very interesting question, do feel free to spell it out and ask.
Okay.
First, for the people that weren't at my first session, I'm Mariana Bocoi. I'm a Devops Consultant, which means I work with servers, infrastructure, deployment, helping development teams be more efficient and effective through tooling and systems. Right, so I'm also a software systems engineering master's. So I have a master's in software systems engineering. I've been a backender for 10 years, and I've been doing DevOps for 1 year. And I interviewed people for 3 different companies. I am part of different organizations as well. I'm a Woman Tech Maker ambassador. I'm part of Pink Programming. I'm one of the code mentors. And I am a co-organizer for the Google Developer Group Cloud Stockholm. A bit about my background. I am from Romania originally, and that's where I finished my bachelor's. Then I went to Germany at this tiny, tiny town at the border between Belgium and Netherlands, where I did my master thesis at Aachen University, and I worked for Ericsson for a while. And then I moved to Sweden. I quit Ericsson to move to Sweden, and I worked at different companies here in Sweden. My main experience with tech interviews is for companies in Sweden, so there might be variations from what I say, depending on what region or country you're applying to. Do check out also what is most common in your area and see past interviews at the company, because it could be different. This talk should cover most things, but depending on that, or depending if you're, for example, a front-end developer, I don't cover that very deeply. You will likely get a JavaScript programming language test anyway, but there might be other questions related to user interface and stuff that I'm not covering. Right, so I'm gonna cover the tech interviews in the format of before the tech interview, during the tech interview, and after. And it's a bit roughly split because I guess a lot of the preparation should be done before, but some things you should keep in mind during the interview. But before the interview, I've actually written a blog post with all the links that I'm gonna talk about this, but it's a different format. But you can check that out, and that I wanted to summarize my experience so far, so check that out. But my first tip for technical interviews is, before you even start preparing, you should ask the recruiter or whomever you're in contact with, how will the interview be? You are 100% entitled to know what's going to happen and to ask questions. You're not allowed to ask exactly what problem you're going to be given, but it's fair enough to ask, okay, what kind of interview will this be? How many interviews are there? What is the rough format? So basically, the questions could be, is this a take-home assignment, or am I coming into the office to do this tech interview? am I still being online at the same time with some people and doing live coding, or what am I gonna do? What kind of assignment will it be? Is it a system design where you have to kind of think on a broader spectrum? Are we going to debug something? Are we going to refactor some code? Like, what kind of assignment will it be? Is there a lot of people say, okay, I'm going to do the tech interview. Yeah, fair enough. And then they realize they can choose the language, and they're not sure which language they should choose. Usually I would say go for the language that you know the best, regardless what language you're interviewing for. But it's worth asking the recruiter if only applications with a certain programming language, not speaking language, programming language is recommended. And you can also ask a wider question of, how can I best prepare for this? The online coding, it could be it could be different things. It could be online coding. As I said, it could be a take-home assignment. You could also get a technical quiz. So I've got that once where there are questions around how would you make sure that you get something from your local computer to GitHub? Like, what command would you use? And then there were like a set of choices, and I found that very interesting. Sometimes it can backfire because the questions are very specific, and yeah, those are the most scary for me, because you're not sure exactly what you're gonna get, whilst coding assignments usually you can figure it out. You could have on-site whiteboarding or even online whiteboarding, and any combination of the above and more. And usually the topics that are covered are algorithms, which means you have to implement something. And I'm going to show something like that today. You can have system design discussions where you say, design me Twitter, and you're gonna have to say, okay, how would you create Twitter with all the different servers and different components and databases and stuff that you would need to create Twitter, for example. Debugging, you could get bad code and be told, okay, this code isn't working, fix it. You could also get debugging in the sense of, there's an error. I got that at one of the interviews where they said, you got an alert in the middle of the night and it says this. What would you do next? And then I had to talk about how would I identify where the error comes from, what is the potential problem. And oftentimes it is fairly complex. I'm not sure if system design or debugging, maybe debugging actual code, but having incident management is probably not as common in junior interviews. You could refactor something, you could get horrible code and you get to refactor it. Also consider, should I write tests? Can I write tests about it? And again, incident management, where you also get to talk about what happens after you got the code, you got the alert. But that's also less likely for a junior interview. But I felt like it's good to list, so you know how it kind of evolves. So more likely is algorithms, debugging the actual code, or refactoring actual code. But again, it's really good to ask, what exactly is this, from the recruiter before you actually say, yes, I'll do this. Because maybe you decide, after you learn what the recruitment process is, you decide that you don't want to do that. And joining this company is not as important to you as going through the stress of doing certain types of interviews. Anyway, there are different platforms to prepare. There's this great tweet from Chris that lists a bunch of them. These are the ones that I have some experience with, and they're fairly kind of good. There's HackerRank, Code Wars, and LeetCode. They mostly have code assignments where you get a problem and you have some, and also KTH, you get a problem and you have some tests to it, and you can submit code in, and it would run more tests than the tests you see, and then you would see, okay, would I pass or wouldn't I not pass? Another cool thing, it's not something to practice interviews, but maybe it is. I really like Advent of Code. It is like an advent calendar, which is counting the days up until Christmas. So 1 to 26th, I guess. I never remember if it's 25 or 26. And it's always depending on cultures. But anyway, every single day you get a different problem to solve. And it's released to the entire world at the same time. And then you can have a nice challenge with your friends solving them. And oftentimes the type of challenges, they're kind of similar to what you would get during interviews. Like the way you would solve the problems would be similar. One of the most interesting ones here is Pramp, because there you actually get the possibility to have an interview dry run with an actual person. Back in the day, it used to be free. Now I think you get a number of free interviews until you actually have to subscribe. But even having those 3 practice runs, if you practice before on other platforms, could be very, very powerful. And usually on this platform, for example, Hacker Earth, it kind of, they sometimes have this path where you actually get great updates in the middle of a talk. Yeah, you could actually get a path on what are the different things to learn or what to focus on. For example, arrays, sorting, searching, and then it kind of goes more difficult from the beginning. And then it is nice to have a plan. It is nice to start with the beginning and go with different difficulties later. But there's different ways in which the different platforms do that. Sometimes they do this. Sometimes they just have levels on the problems. For quizzes, you could try Testum, or on Glassdoor, people actually post. So if you don't get a lot of information from the recruiter, you can still check Glassdoor, where people post how their interview process was. So you can check, for this type of role, how did that look? So it's very interesting to check Glassdoor. And another one for system designs. Again, it depends if a junior developer gets this or not, but the industry has a problem with junior developer roles, because usually they're junior developers that need to have 2 years of experience and extra on top. So, well, it depends. So for system design, the thing that I would recommend is to do to check out dev skills and the problems there, or to create your personal project and kind of push little by little to do more with the project. Like, for example, you have a static website, and then you decide, okay, now I'm going to use Google Maps API, or I'm going to use the Spotify API to play a song. And then I'm going to put it on GitHub, and then I'm going to run the tests with GitHub Actions. And, you kind of start small, and then you add up small by little until you have a more production-like environment. But then it's really good to have some kind of mentor or something, or someone that could guide you on what is the best next step. So um, that would be a good way to start understanding how a system is built and what are the different parts. Another thing is this blog post. I think is really great um, for system design. And it talks about how they think around the system design. What are the questions that they ask? How do they go about answering and meeting the expectations of the interviewer? And then you also have on YouTube different videos like these two on how to do this. But again, system design is not very common. But as tips go, you should really start with Hello World. Try to practice on the same platform or as similar as it gets to the interview. Like, for example, if you get a KTH, you can hover the link that you get in the email and you can see, oh, it's a KTH problem. You don't know which problem it is, but it's worth trying to solve a couple of problems on KTH before you actually start the home assignment, just to make sure, okay, do I need to have anything set up on my environment or anything like that? For example, for KTH, it doesn't really provide you tests. So you cannot really check with different inputs before you actually submit. And it doesn't give you a lot of things because of that. Like, for example, in Code Wars, you get tests, so you can write some code and then you see if it compiles or not before you submit. But in KTH, it doesn't really work. Again, use the best language for you. Start setting up a practice habit. Like, do one small problem 3 times a week or something. Then little by little, you will get better at it. If you can, you could do one small problem every day and start from a lower level. But not everyone has a lot of time to dedicate for this. But do start some sort of practice where you do it over time, because it takes time to really grow into it and realize what the patterns are, what are typical problems, and things like that. And oftentimes, when you solve some code and submit a solution on these platforms, you can see the code from other people. So you can see, what did they do? And learn, like, why did they use this way of writing code? Oh, their code is so small. How did they manage that? And sometimes keep in mind that even when the code looks very small and tiny, if it's not readable, it is bad code. So as long as you can read the code easily and understand what it does, that is better code than really, really less code, but not a lot of readability. Now, my favorite topic. I'm not sure if people still ask about this or not, but I felt like I need to mention it because it seems like a big thing, big O, which is the complexity, but it's actually not. There are a couple of rules of thumb that you can follow, and you can likely get a good approximation. I'm also going to explain what it is. So big O means order of magnitude. And there's 2 ways of measuring it, is in space, like how much actual disk space will it take, and how much time. And the whole point of it is how much more space would it take if instead of an array of 5 elements, I would give it an array with 1,000 elements? Like, how would the space consumption increase? Is it going to increase linearly, like from 5 to 1,000 to 5 to 1,000, like the same kind of increase? Or is it going to be a power of 2? And again, you have space, which is the actual disk space, and you have complexity. And complexity is really just counting, and I'm going to get into that soon. Yes. And another 2 good things is input. You should only look at the input that changes in size, and you should remove all the constants when you look at it. And let's get into it. Let's say you have to find the complexity of this code. How do you do it? Can anyone tell me? Have you heard of BIGO before? Nobody? Had a quick read, not sure how to measure. Great. So the complexity, which is the time, or rather I would say count, the way you would measure is, let's say you have an operation and it takes 1 second. And every single line of your code takes, that's very slow. Let's say millisecond, less than millisecond. Anyway, 1, you have, it takes 1. Insert time measurement here. So the print would take 1. But then you have this for loop where you have this 1 line of code that gets executed for a couple of times. Like, for example, for I love cake, it would go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 up until 9, and then it would return 9. And worst case, it will return 11, right? Because what if you ask, so this code, for people that are not very much into Python, it checks what is the first instance of the letter K. So it calls this function. So worst case, it could be 11. So what does that mean? If we have an array of 11, then it would take 11 milliseconds in the worst case. If we have text that is 100 letters long, it could be 100 in the worst case. So it grows linearly. And again, n is the number of letters in the text, but not because it's a text, but rather that's what we loop on. So you really have to look at the loops. For example, if we have 2 loops, we would do this operation n times n times in the worst case, if we go through the entire 2 for loops. And that means if you have a nested for loop like this, you would get an n square complexity. But if your code just prints some text, then it's O of 1, which means it's constant, because you always will, this will always take 1 millisecond or 1 0 point whatever milliseconds, however long this takes, regardless what the text is. Theoretically, you cannot optimize it more. Let's talk about and that means that you really have to look for what is your most nested for loops. And that includes, like, for example, if you have a for loop that calls a function that has a for loop in it, then it's a nested for loop. If you have a for loop that calls a recursion, then that also counts. And like, for example, if you had a simple for loop on top, that would be n, and this would be n square, and you simplify that away. So it's always kind of the biggest one. You can read more about it online, but the basic thing is look for the nested for loops or recursions, and the biggest nested thing you have, that's going to be the magnitude. So if you can avoid nesting for loops, then you've won. And that could be done by adding an array on top or whatever. Then space complexity is the same, but what is the biggest thing that you've used? If you had a string or an array, it's O of n. If you have just an int, it's kind of a constant. If you have a matrix, which is a 2x2 array, it's O of n square. And the rule of thumb is that is the biggest data structure you use, kind of, for space. There are exceptions, but that's kind of basic. Any questions on that before I move away? No. Okay, great. Everyone understands. And another good thing to do with interviews is you have to practice them. So pick a friend. You might have seen the slide from the previous one. It's because I love the slide. Pick a friend, but not just a friend, a best friend, because a friend will help you move a couch and a best friend will help you move a body or give honest feedback. And you really need honest feedback. You need to have a friend that can say, yeah, you really need to work on these couple of things because you need it. Rather than, yeah, that sounded great. And then you failed the interview because you didn't really get feedback early enough. So you need to have either a friend or a complete stranger off the internet that you ask if they could do a dry run with you. LinkedIn is great for approaching people for that. Some basic things. Do you know your CV and LinkedIn? If you worked on things, remember what are the technologies you used and what are the things you've done at that company, because it might come up in questions and it's good to brush up on that. Also, again, I've said that for the manager interview, but it's the same for here. Know the company and the product. Check the website, check if they have public code, check if they have open source code. I don't have this here, but you should totally check if they have any code listed on GitHub or anything. But check everything you can find out about the product and the company. It might be a good thing. You might be able to say something about the product or something that you like about the product or the tech stack. But don't focus too much on tools for reasons. Also, this is very important, and I cannot stress it enough. Do a tech check. Sometimes you need to share your screen. So on whatever platform that you're going to have the interview in, because you're going to get an invite and you're going to be able to see what platform they're going to use. And usually it's one of these three. Check, can you turn on the camera? Is the microphone working? Can you share your entire screen or just a window? Just practice that before the interview. It's very important. Sometimes you need to reschedule an interview because of that, and it just becomes more stressful for you during the interview. It's exciting. It's kind of the same format as most interviews, I guess. You get a bit of an intro about the interview, what's going to happen. Basically, you get someone will tell you about this format. The interviewers will introduce themselves and what they do, and sometimes they add a hobby. You do an intro, and that's not when you go in depth with the technical stuff. You can mention some things in passing, but it has to be a short intro, because this is just to warm up, to get a bit of connection, but then the interview actually starts afterwards. And they will ask you what they want to know. Then there's going to be the green part of it depends on what you're going to do, which is, again, likely looking at some code or debugging the code and doing that. And then at the end, you're going to have the chance of asking questions. Most good companies give you the chance to ask questions from your interviewer at the end. And that could be asking more about the tech stack or anything that you want to know at the end. The intro could be similar to the one you used in the manager interview. You could drop in some more technical things, but you just talk about a little bit about your background. And of course, as a junior, you maybe don't have a lot of the points here. You can substitute with why are you joining tech if you're switching and you haven't studied information. If you haven't studied IT, you can add in why are you changing? What kind of courses did you do? Like, just adapt this to your profile and try to highlight what are the good parts or what are the parts that can map back to an IT role. These tips are the same in both interviews. You should breathe. Make sure you take pauses so that the interviewers can actually ask you questions. You should keep your answers fairly short. So again, you can check in if you understood correctly or if that's the right direction. You can take notes. Sometimes it's not as possible in tech interviews because you're either typing or something, but you can definitely take notes if, for example, you've heard some technology that you're curious about, so you could take notes about that. And remember, interviews are a conversation, so even when you have to show some technical task, you still should involve the interviewer and ask for clarifications about the task or things like that. Specifically for tech interviews, you should write your assumptions. It's especially important for live coding or live debugging. Write down the assumptions. If it's a whiteboard session, write it in the corner of the board. You can write the inputs. What are the things that you're supposed to do? And any kind of constraints or things that you're not going to cover in your solution to begin with. It's good to write it down. You can, because then it's there and you can go back to it. If you're not in person and if it's live coding, you can start a comment section and write it in the comment section. You can, instead of just jumping to implement to begin with, you can write comments of what you're supposed to do in the code and then implement on top of that. Because then you can make sure that you're focusing on the right thing. And also, it helps clarify things. You're going to say, oh, I'm getting a string as an input. Should I check if it's a string or not for untyped languages? Or does it have special characters? Or say, okay, I'm not going to check for special characters to begin with. And then they're going to think, oh, you thought about special characters. That's great. Start simple. You might start thinking, oh, there might be special characters here. You should not include those checks in your first implementation. You should make it work with a simple case. You can write down a simple example or two that you can walk through the code with. But don't go into error cases or things like that when you write the first iteration. Think of it as an iteration. You write code that works and then you make it better. But it's good if you manage to do something that is kind of compilable by the end of the session. If it's whiteboarding, nobody's gonna mind you skipping a semicolon or something. If it's on the computer, it should likely compile and run the basic tests. Think out loud. Think out loud. Think out loud. I cannot say it this often or loud enough or too many times. Your interviewers are not mind readers. If you are sitting in front of the screen or in front of the whiteboard and you're thinking very hard and your mind is running 10,000 miles an hour, what it looks to us is you are sitting in front of the whiteboard and staring at it. The best thing you could do is you can start talking out loud, saying, oh, so I have the string and I need to find the first character. I could go through each character and return something when I get to that character. And then, it helps you slow down and keep it simple, but it also helps us understand, or, oh, I need to do this. I wonder if should I split it already in a function and whatever? And when the candidates are actually going into too much of a complex path that we feel we're not going to be able to cover it in the interview, or this is not the direction we want to go to, we would actually interrupt and say, oh, why not start simpler? So it really is in your benefit to talk out loud. And also be a compiler. So go through each line of code and try to think, okay, what does this line of code do? Especially if you're running code in an interface and you get an error. You should go through line by line and think, okay, what does this line do? What do we have in our variables? It's really great. And the last thing that's very important in tech interviews, admit when you don't know something. You can say, I don't know what it is. Like, for example, if they say you should create an anagram when you get this text, and then you say, I'm not sure what an anagram is. Could you explain what exactly is expected of me? Because it's not a language test, it's a coding test. So if you don't understand a word, that's fine, as long as you can implement the requirements. And part of the requirements is to clarify the requirements. If there's some part of the request that is not clear, you should ask, okay, I don't know what this is. Can you tell me? And then the interviewer will tell you what it is, and then you can move on from there. Very important. Also, if you don't check for errors or things like that, or I don't know, whenever you don't know something, you should say, I don't know this, can you give me a hint? How would you solve it? I need to write this down. It would be fun learning about this later. I don't know. but you always should admit that you don't know. And for example, I taught you a bunch of things about big O at the beginning and rule of thumbs. If it comes up, you can always say, well, I've heard that you look for loops, and the more nested it is, that's the power of n that it is, but I'm not quite sure how to explain it more in depth, or I didn't get it more in depth. So that's fine. It's fine to say, I know this, but only parts of this. And it's important because we are looking for people that can say that they don't know things. And now, let's do a demo and let's hope that things do not explode. Are you excited about this? You're going to actually have to interact. So I hope you're all awake.
Before we do the demo, can I just ask one question to piggyback off the
Yes.
last thing you said? What
Yes.
would you recommend for a junior developer in an interview who gets stuck in a technical question? What should they do?
That's a great question. If a junior developer gets stuck, they can say, I'm stuck. Can you give me a hint? Or I'm not quite sure what we were supposed to do. Go through the requirements again, go through what you've done already, see what's left to do, and kind of, it's always good to not just say I'm stuck. It's good to say what you're stuck in. Like, for example, you're not sure how to write a for loop. This is probably not the case, but I don't know. You're not sure exactly how you would do something. And then you interact with the interviewer. The interviewer is there to, when I was doing interviews, if someone would get stuck, I would interact with the person and try to hint in the right direction and try to kind of guide the people to what they're supposed to do, because interviewers are not there, hopefully, again, I cannot speak for all interviewers, but they're not there to be mean to you or to put you on the spot. They're there to understand what you know. And it doesn't really help if we're just staring at each other because you're stuck.
Right.
So if you say you're stuck, I will probably help you. And it's good to have a bit more details or go through the requirements first and what you've done already before saying, I'm not sure what to do next. Right. What would you
tips
recommend?
Yeah, okay, so 2 tips that I would recommend are things that I've actually done in interviews, especially when I was more junior. The first one is to solve the problem in pseudocode.
Yes.
So for those of you who don't know, pseudocode is sort of like a mix between speaking language and code, and just to demonstrate how you might solve the problem.
Yeah, like for example, I had this thing here. You would go, oh, let's say the requirement says you need to get the letter, the first the index in the string where the letter K is. You could say, oh, we have the string, and then you can also visually solve it in a way, not only pseudocode. You can just say, I would go through the string one by one, and then
Yeah. And then the other tactic that I have used in the past when I was really stuck and like truly had no clue is just to demonstrate how I would learn something that I didn't know yet. So the sources that I would use, or just generally how I typically solve a problem when I'm trying to learn on my own.
That's a great tip. I should take a note. Great. This is a website, one of the websites that I recommended, and it's called Code Wars. And the way it works is you go to practice and you get a long list of problems. You can select a programming language, let's say Erlang. And then you get a bunch of things, and then you can check the difficulty. And 8 is the easiest, and 1 is the hardest. And then you can start with the easiest ones. And for example, as I said, try to practice on the same platform. And you always start with the hello world on each platform. Usually there's a very, very simple problem that's print something or return very basic things, so that you understand how to use the platform, or go through the intro of the platform. But the way this one works is you have this part here where you have, or rather here, you have some instructions which says write a function that checks if a given string, case insensitive, is a palindrome. And then it has a link to what a palindrome is. A palindrome is a word that is the same when you read it from the first letter to the last letter, or from the last letter to the first letter. So it's, you can see it in the test. ABBA is a palindrome. And then you can check, okay. You can see the output of your test runs, and you can see your past solutions. Because I've solved this before, now I do have a past solution. Sometimes you don't. Rather, you don't unless you've solved it. So how would we write this? Does anyone have ideas how we would start checking if S is a palindrome? Anyone? I think Python has an inbuilt reverse method. That is a great, what would you do with the inbuilt reverse method? You would call reverse, and then what? Let's say there is a reverse method. I don't know if there is. Let's say if reversed. Always name your variables in a good way. String reversed s equals s dot equals is somewhere. When is equals here? Don't look. A reverse string equals s dot reverse, and then what you do with it. You see if it's the same as the input. So s equals. You should not change keyboards before a talk. Reverse s. That sounds great enough. Let's see if Python has a reverse. There's a button that runs test, and it says a bunch of things. Reverse is not a thing in Python. But great idea, and this is how you would reverse, this is how you would reverse a string in Python. So, ta-da! We have a fail test. Why is it failing? Pretend you didn't see my solution. Yes, uppercase or lowercase. And that means that we need to kind of do s lower, slower. That's because I don't know where the underscore is. So s lower is equal to also make sure you have a good keyboard. When you do the test, so that you don't get into the same problems as me. So now if we run this, then it will send the request, and Hopefully things are gonna be fine. I think things are gonna be fine. I don't know why it's stuck. No. Ah, yeah, because I'm still checking for S, not for S lower, which is also something that you might not see in the interview, that you haven't checked that one. So do not assume too many things. Check if everything is where it's supposed to be. And if you change the name of something, do change the name everywhere. Like, for example, in the reverse as well. I'm making a lot of errors here, which is fine. It's fine to make errors during interview. People are nervous. They are more likely to have errors, and then it's fine. You should just say, "Oh, right, it's supposed to be this," or yeah. It takes a while until you run into all the possible copy paste errors, and really spot the fact that it's a copy paste error, or you renamed something and you didn't do that. So everything passed. I'm going to attempt it, and it's going to say, well, it all passed. And you can see that when it does the basics, it does this, but it also checks with a lot of different things to see if you're really doing this in a good way. And you could also, if you wanted to, you could also write another test here and say, I don't know, keyboard smash. And then it will include it in the test, which is great. But for example, if you go to a platform like KTH, it doesn't have that. So it's better to solve the code on your computer and then paste it in here than to not be able to do this. Yeah, great. So this was the demo. Hope you enjoyed it. It didn't burn as much as I thought, except for the keyboard errors. It went pretty fine. And to explain the Python thing a bit, it's the start, stop, and step. It's kind of an iteration of Python things. You can look into slices and reverting a string with slices if you want to. But anyway, errors will happen, and that's also part of what coding is. And a lot of the coding is actually Googling, having coffee breaks, going for a walk because you can't figure things out. So it's part of coding. Also, a lot of things are based on each other, and sometimes they're ugly. Writing bad code is not great, but it does happen. But the problem with interviews is that it doesn't really take that in account. It's not a realistic scenario. Nobody's gonna, well, depends if you're doing a palindrome checker website, but oftentimes the kind of problems that you get in interviews are not exactly a good reflection of what day-to-day work is, unless you get a home assignment that is bigger. And there's no bad place to be. I love this around front end and back end. Front enders sometimes feel like back end is a monster and hard, and back enders go like, there's a lot of order and automation and great things on our side, and there's chaos with all kinds of screen sizes on the other side. So I don't know, during the interview you can also talk about frustrations and stuff sometimes. But anyway, after the interview, you should remember that interviews are only 1 to 2 hours. Depending how far you get, people will not get a good overview of what you are like, how much do you know. They will only get this 1 hour slice of you. And they will take a decision with that 1 hour slice. And maybe you've had a horrible day, or you were so nervous you couldn't think straight. And that's okay. There's always the next interview. And you should keep learning and make it a project, like a URL turner, find a renaming tool, tweet evaluator. Just create a project. Just keep on learning about the interview. Think about what went good and what could be improved. There's some more resources on learning I can share. These are books. Some of them show how long I've been in software development, particularly working effectively with legacy code. I feel like it's pretty old, but still true. And of course, the side of reliability engineering, some courses that you could do. There's a lot of information out there. And just because you're done with an interview, you can do a lot of just learning about things and diving into the tech world, because that helps also with tech interviews, but not as much as doing code problems and the dev skills. Do you have any questions? That's all I had for you today. Do you have any more questions? I know we're up to time, but I can stay like 5 minutes or something longer.
Any questions, anybody? If nobody has anything, I have something, but I want to give you guys a chance to ask anything you want.
I don't have experience. Junior roles sometimes require a few years of experience. I think having personal projects, it would change the way you talk about software, because you start realizing what are, so in here, there's only this part of code, but this is not everything around software development. You take this and you have to deploy it somewhere and it runs, right? You have to run tests on it every time you update the code automatically, because you cannot rely on people to always run the tests and spend the time on it. So you can dive into all the other things around it and talk about that as well when you have a personal project. So it does change the way you talk about software from a more theoretical perspective, like theoretically you would do this, to a more hands-on perspective of what would you prefer to do, not what people taught you on how to do. How come junior devs can have a few years of experience? Well, I did not subscribe in the whole junior senior things. I have met people with 10 years of experience that didn't know how to write clean code. And it's not because they were bad, it's because they were doing the same job for 12 years. It's 12 years was the same year repeated 12 times. And that's just generally, sometimes you have bad luck, you land in a role and you stay there and you don't see anything outside.
Speaking of clean code, Clean Code is the name of a great book. If you guys are interested in learning how to write clean code.
Yeah, unfortunately, the author of Clean Code is both a racist and a sexist. So I would recommend The Pragmatic Programmer. You can still read Clean Code if you want to, but an alternative would definitely be The Pragmatic Programmer. There's a plethora of good books to learn about how to code in a clean fashion. Also, definitely check out functional programming. It changes the way you think about programming.
Yes, and we have a functional programming workshop coming up in November for those who are interested.
Yeah, functional programming is cool. and less prone to issues, of some sort. State is evil. Like, any tips for a person that has a gap of 12 years to taking care of her family? Start with catching up on what you knew before, trying to figure out what do you want to do, and start building up drip by drip this lake of, I wouldn't say knowledge, because you don't really, I mean, you get some knowledge, but more confidence and practice, because you really need to practice interviews in order to pass interviews. So think about what you enjoyed doing before. Be honest in the interview on why you took the years off. And yeah. Madsen, your thoughts?
Yes, I had one question for you. In one of the slides of the interview structure, you mentioned asking questions at the end of the interview, like 10 to 15 minutes. What questions
Yeah.
would you recommend that people ask, or what types of questions?
Well, it depends. What is important to you for the job? Are you interested in how do people get development? Are you interested in if people get mentorship opportunities or a buddy? Are you interested in on how the team works, if they pair up to solve problems, or if everyone just goes alone in their corner and solve the things? Like, it depends on what you're interested in. It if there's certain things that were mentioned during the interview that you would like to ask about, you can go back and ask about that. If you want to know more about the tech stack, but it doesn't have to be only about tech things. Like, for example, you can ask because usually in tech interviews you get actual developers that work in teams. And if you're really lucky, it could be the developers that you will work with, but it's not always the case. You can ask them, what do they enjoy in the company? What's their biggest challenge nowadays? What is something that they get frustrated with? I don't know. Everything. Ask. Take all the minutes and ask all the questions. But make sure to decide on what's important for you to learn.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Does anyone else have any last questions?
So for the 12 years, I actually had a one-to-one session with a person recently who came back from maternity leave, and she got a job. She could start working with it. At the beginning it was harder, but then things came back, so starting. And she got a job now. Actually, she got 2 offers. So it doesn't, gaps are not necessarily important. Have you ever had a super interesting question from a candidate? Super interesting question. I don't know. I'm always curious what people ask. I don't know if I remember a specific one at this point, actually. The most dreadful one is, what am I unhappy with? Or what are my biggest challenges? And then I always try to be as honest as I can. But it's hard sometimes. Yeah, those are the harder questions for me sometimes. Yeah, I don't have an answer. That's it. Do you have a question that you
Well,
remember?
I've never actually interviewed anyone for a technical position, but I do have a few questions that I like to ask.
Okay.
Um, so I usually like to ask about development opportunities, like you said, if there's any
Hmm.
budget for that, or if there'll be any type of mentorships. I like to ask for the benchmarks for success in the role that I'm applying for. So,
Yeah,
like,
how do
what do
people
they
get promoted?
exactly, and what are they sort of looking for? Like, for example, in the first 6 months, what are your expectations of the person who fills this role?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and then I like to ask if I can, speak to former employees of the company or if anyone that they've managed before. I also like to ask why the position is empty.
That's a nice one. I need to
Yeah,
steal it
because
from you.
that can sometimes give you good insight into the dynamics of the team or of the company itself.
Hmm. Yeah. But often, hmm, yeah, you can ask that in both the technical and the manager interview, but some questions you would get different answers in the different
Mm,
interviews. So,
definitely.
yeah.
And then, and of course, my last question that I usually like to ask, it might not be so relevant for junior roles, but I mean, hey, it can't hurt to ask, right? But the
No.
question is, what is the budget for the role? So,
Uh-huh.
sort of like how much are they going to pay? But you say it in kind of a nicer way.
Interesting. Usually I wait until they ask me and
Mm-hmm.
I reply back with that I actually would be very interested to know for the position and role responsibilities, how much do they usually pay a person with that profile?
Mm-hmm. That's a
And
good question.
then like turn it back because they will ask you about salary.
Yeah.
And I always turn it back. I stopped saying. And of course, if it's too low, I will say it's too low. My expectations were this. But then it's already like they said first.
Mm-hmm. We have
Technologies.
another question here in the chat.
Would it be easier to find a job in PHP or Node Express? You know what, Patrick? The easiest job to find is in COBOL because nobody's doing mainframes anymore. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, right? People
Yeah.
people run away from that, so there's a shortage of people that do COBOL. So it's very highly paid and highly looked for because banks are not moving away from it anytime soon, like very old banks. Um, but PHP or Node Express, it depends. It depends on what the market is at that point. Node and Express, there's a lot of people that do that. Maybe there are less people that do PHP nowadays, and there are people with a lot of legacy code in PHP, and they can't find people. So, do you enjoy learning PHP or do you prefer to learn Node or Express? It's also a matter of what you would like to learn. Yeah. So, if you enjoy Node more, then you can widen your search to remote jobs. Um, yeah, interesting. Every developer I know uses Node and Express. Very interesting. But every developer uses PHP. I think it depends on where you're looking and what the market is. So you really have to look out and see where is the demand. And at the same time, if you really want to learn something or do a specific thing, do that. Get good at get good at that takes ages, but do that and search, widen the search, and there will be something. I hope that makes sense. Mm. for example, Java. I know how to code in Java. Would I take a Java job at this point? No, because I've played around with Kotlin and I've played around with more functional programming, and it's sometimes tough that I need to do so much to make the compiler happy, and it just doesn't make me happy. But some people are really, really in love with Java, and I respect that. So it very much depends on what you enjoy doing. And if you enjoy doing something, you will develop with that because you enjoy doing it. So
And that's
it's
the
good
nice
to
thing
go for
about,
that. Mhm.
yeah, that's the nice thing about tech as well, is that there are so many jobs available that you can really follow your technical passion and like land a job.
Yeah, and it's also about perspective, right? I showed you this one where people go like, "Oh, backend is such a big monster, and you don't know what it is, and there's so many different things, and it's scary."
Hmm.
And then there's people that go like, "Oh, front end, it's so hard, and I don't know how to get it right, and how do you even align a div anyway?"
Yeah,
It's about perspectives. Whatever brings you joy is what you should do.
great. Well, we are almost 20 minutes over.
Wow.
Thank you so much for this super informative and educational workshop.
Yes, I have a bunch of links in the slides, so I hope I can share the slides with you, and then you also share those together with the recordings.
Absolutely.
And
The
sorry
recording,
for the voice.
no worries. I'm just glad
Mhm.
that you were able to do this today. So thank you.
No problem.
I'm going to
And
stop
I've also
recording.
managed a live code.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. It's so true what you said before about checking the tech that you're going to be using. I remember
Hmm.
my first workshop that I was hosting earlier in the summer. I did not check the tech. And I wasn't able to connect to this platform for like the first 40 minutes that I was supposed to be presenting.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
so
we did end up
hard.
having to reschedule, but
I mean, I didn't
yeah.
have a lot of code to write, so it was fine. Cool. Thanks everyone, and it's so nice that you joined.